Sometimes, life doesn't change with a loud announcement. Sometimes it changes with a whisper, and when a billionaire leaned in and said, "Pretend to be my girlfriend," she thought it was a joke, until he revealed the one rule that stole her breath: "Don't fall in love with me." Life has a way of unfolding quietly, almost casually, before it suddenly presents us with a moment so unexpected, so unplanned, that it shatters the rhythm we've grown accustomed to. These are the moments that don't announce themselves with fireworks or grand entrances. Instead, they slip into our lives disguised as ordinary conversations, accidental encounters, or a whisper spoken at the right time by the wrong person, or perhaps the wrong time by the right person. For her, the moment arrived not with a spotlight, but with a whisper. A whisper from a man whose presence alone could fill a room with tension, whose decisions shaped companies, economies, and destinies. A man known for his precision, his ambition, and his self-control. A man who did not need to ask anyone for anything, and yet he asked her, "Pretend to be my girlfriend." The words hung in the air, strange, unexpected, impossible to process all at once. It was the kind of request that made the ground shift beneath her feet, the kind that forced her heart to skip, gasp, and question everything she thought she understood about her life. At first, she wondered if she had misheard him. Why her? Why this? Why now? It felt absurd. It felt unreal. The world around them seemed to freeze, the noise dissolving into a distant hum as the weight of his request settled over her. But that is the power of an unexpected moment. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It intrudes, it disrupts. It challenges you in ways you never imagined you could be challenged. His request wasn't just unusual. It was intimate. It was bold. It was dangerous. And more than anything, it was personal. She stood there, stunned not because of the words themselves, but because of the person who uttered them. He was the kind of man who never appeared uncertain, never stumbled, never hesitated. His world was built on absolute control, yet the way he whispered the words, it wasn't commanding, it wasn't businesslike. There was something else beneath it, something raw, unspoken, almost vulnerable. That vulnerability struck her harder than the request itself. Moments like these, when the unexpected collides with the familiar, have the power to reveal things we never notice in the ordinary flow of life. They peel back layers, expose insecurities, and illuminate truths we might otherwise ignore. She realized in that brief pause that sometimes the strongest people are the ones carrying the heaviest, quietest burdens. Sometimes the ones who seem invincible are the ones who fear being seen the most. The request forced her to confront a reality she had never considered, that the line between her simple, predictable life and his vast, chaotic world was thinner than she imagined. That one whisper could blur it completely. At that moment, she felt the world expanding around her, fast, dizzying, overwhelming. She was suddenly aware of how fragile her sense of direction had been. Everything she knew, her routines, her expectations, her assumptions, felt small in comparison to this sudden shift. He wasn't just asking for a role. He was offering her a doorway into a world larger, louder, and far more dangerous than hers. The power of the unexpected lies not only in the disruption it causes, but in the questions it forces us to ask. Questions she found herself wrestling with instantly. What does he gain from this? Why does he think I'm the one who can help him? What will happen if I say yes? What will happen if I say no? She knew that unexpected opportunities often come dressed as risks. They challenge the limits we place on ourselves. They tug at the corners of our comfort zones. They demand that we choose not between right and wrong, but between safety and possibility. And yet, the fear that bubbled inside her wasn't a warning. It was awareness. Awareness that his request held the potential to alter everything. Her emotions, her future, her understanding of herself. That is the true power of an unexpected request. It forces us to see ourselves in ways we never have before. It shows us what we're capable of, what we're afraid of, what we secretly want even if we can't admit it aloud. As she looked at him, his guarded eyes, his perfectly composed posture, the tension in his jaw, she realized that this moment wasn't about pretending. It wasn't about playing a role. It wasn't even about him or her individually. It was about the collision of two worlds, a moment that demanded a choice, a moment that would not leave her unchanged. The whisper may have been soft, but its impact was seismic. It shook loose emotions she didn't know she had, awakening something restless, something curious, something drawn to the mystery in front of her. Because sometimes the most powerful turning points in life don't arrive with clarity. They arrive wrapped in confusion, fear, and a spark of possibility. The unexpected doesn't just alter the path. It redefines the journey, and that whisper, simple, impossible, unforgettable, was the moment her journey truly began. Power has a way of shaping the people who carry it. It molds them, sharpens them, and builds walls around them so tall that most never even attempt to look over. And in his case, power wasn't just a title, it was armor. It was reputation. It was the unspoken expectation that he must always remain untouchable, unshaken, and impenetrable. But beneath all that armor, beneath the perfect suits and flawless posture, beneath the billions and the brilliance, there existed a vulnerability so quiet, so deeply buried, that almost no one had ever seen it. Most didn't even suspect it was there. She didn't see it at first either. To her, he was everything the world claimed he was. A man who could buy anything. A man whose signature changed markets. A man with more influence than some governments. A man surrounded by people yet untouched by anyone. But it wasn't until that whispered request, "Pretend to be my girlfriend," that she noticed the slight tremor in his voice, the hesitation in his breath, the shadow flickering through his usually unreadable eyes. For a man known for precision and control, such a small crack was enough to betray something deeper. Vulnerability, not obvious, not dramatic, but real, and like all vulnerabilities, it didn't announce itself. It hid itself in silences, in the way he avoided her gaze after asking the question, in the way his jaw tightened not out of pride but out of fear. Fear she might refuse, fear of appearing weak, fear of needing something he couldn't obtain through business or power. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that his life had been built on a foundation of isolation disguised as privilege. People adored his money, they respected his intelligence, they feared his power. But no one truly knew him. To the world, he was a man carved from stone, flawless and untouchable. But stone cracks too, and his cracks were carved by years of betrayal, abandonment, and the constant pressure of living in a spotlight that blinded more than it illuminated. He was a man who couldn't tell whether someone cared about him, or about what having him could provide, so he stopped letting people care at all. He hosted events, but never attended them fully. He negotiated deals, but never built trust. He shook hands, but never formed bonds. He smiled for cameras, but never with his eyes. Loneliness for him wasn't an emptiness. It was a routine he had accepted. But vulnerability is a strange creature. It doesn't disappear just because we hide it. It lingers beneath the surface, quietly pushing, quietly waiting for a moment when it can finally breathe, and that moment came when he saw her. She was different, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. She didn't chase him, didn't flatter him, didn't tremble under his status. She spoke plainly. She questioned him. She didn't treat him like a billionaire. She treated him like a person. That alone made her dangerous. And that alone made her necessary, because for the first time in years, he felt something he had forgotten: the desire to be understood. It wasn't love. It wasn't passion. It was recognition. A recognition that she could slip through the cracks in his armor, not because she tried, but because she didn't. His vulnerability showed not in grand gestures, but in small, almost invisible ways. In the way his eyes softened for half a second before he looked away. In the way he cleared his throat before speaking about anything personal. In the way his fingers tapped against the table when he was unsure. In the way he used logic to hide emotion. In the way he asked for her help, but phrased it like a business arrangement. This was a man who had everything, except the ability to trust, except the warmth of honest companionship, except the simple comfort of hearing someone say, You don't have to face everything alone. That was the truth hidden behind his unexpected request. He didn't just need someone to play a role. He needed someone to stand beside him, even if only for a moment. He needed someone who wasn't bought, bribed, threatened, or impressed. Someone who could see the man, not the empire. He had spent years mastering the art of hiding his humanity, of appearing stronger than he felt. But vulnerability has its own language, the language of hesitation, of avoidance, of quiet hope. When she agreed to his request, even tentatively, something shifted inside him. Not because she had given him what he asked for, but because in that moment he felt seen. Not as the billionaire whispering a favor, but as a man reaching out through the cracks of his own loneliness. What she didn't realize, what he could never admit, was that this arrangement meant far more to him than it ever could to her. Because for the first time in a long time, someone saw his vulnerability and didn't use it against him. And that alone was enough to leave him breathless. Control is a beautiful lie, one we cling to because the truth feels far too unpredictable. People like him, people who build empires from sheer willpower, believe they can master everything: negotiations, markets, decisions, outcomes. They learn to bend the world to their intentions. They thrive on discipline, on strategy, on perfection. But the heart is the one battlefield where control is nothing more than an illusion. And he knew this. That's why he created his rule: don't fall in love with me. To anyone else, the rule might have sounded arrogant, self-assured, almost theatrically confident. But beneath that simple sentence lay a secret he could not afford to reveal. He wasn't protecting her from falling in love, he was protecting himself. He believed that setting boundaries, constructing emotional fences, and turning intimacy into a contract would shield him from the chaos he feared most. He believed that if he defined the terms, he could define the outcome. But control stops being control the moment feelings enter the room. He had spent years mastering every corner of his life. Boardrooms bowed to him. Advisors relied on him. Airports waited for his jet. Calendars bent to his will. Everything he touched obeyed order. Everything except the ache he carried silently, the ache of wanting connection while fearing it. And so he built rules. Rules that kept people at a distance. Rules that made emotions feel like liabilities. Rules that turned relationships into transactions. Rules that made him feel safe, even when he wasn't, but when he whispered that request. Quiet, vulnerable, dangerous. He cracked open the very shield he depended on. The moment she entered his life, even in the form of a pretend role, the old rules began to tremble, because she wasn't predictable. She wasn't scripted. She wasn't something he could strategize around. Control became complicated the moment she looked at him without fear, without calculation, without expectation. Her honesty threatened him more than any business rival ever could. Her presence challenged the invisible order he had forced upon himself. He noticed it in tiny, unsettling moments, like how he found himself checking her expressions before he spoke, subconsciously caring about whether his words affected her, like how her laughter, unpolished and unfiltered, pulled something warm from him he hadn't felt in years, like how her silence didn't feel like judgment but understanding, like how, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the master of the moment. He was simply a man experiencing it. Control slipped through his fingers quietly at first. Not in obvious ways, but in the softest, smallest details. The way he thought about her when he shouldn't. The way his heartbeat changed when she stepped into the room. The way he caught himself imagining conversations they hadn't yet had. The way he noticed her hands, her voice, the glow of her presence, things he had no right to notice. And that terrified him, because losing control in business meant a risk. But losing control in emotions meant exposure. Exposure to disappointment, exposure to vulnerability, exposure to the one thing he had worked his entire life to avoid, being hurt. That's why he created the rule, not to limit her, but to anchor himself. He thought that by declaring a boundary, he could prevent the inevitable. He believed that by framing their arrangement as strictly professional, he could keep his heart from wandering into forbidden territory. But rules, when it comes to matters of the heart, are nothing but fragile threads, and he felt those threads fray each time she smiled, each time she challenged him, each time she stood close enough for him to smell her perfume, each time she surprised him with the kind of sincerity that money could never purchase. He tried to retreat into logic, his oldest defense. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it was strategic. He told himself she was simply playing a part. But logic evaporates the moment longing becomes real. Every time he reminded himself of the rule, it felt less like a boundary and more like a confession that he was afraid of what she might mean to him, that he feared the softness she brought out in him, that he feared losing the one thing he valued above power, control over his own heart. She sensed this without him ever expressing it. Not through his words, but through the tension in his shoulders, the shift in his stare, the rare moments where his voice softened around her name. She noticed the war inside him, the war between who he had trained himself to be and who he was becoming in her presence. Control had been his greatest ally. Now it was becoming his greatest lie. Because the truth he refused to face was simple. You cannot control the things that matter most. Not love. Not connection, not the quiet longing between two people who were never meant to collide, and yet did. The illusion of control was slipping, slowly, dangerously, inevitably, and he knew it, even if he refused to admit it aloud. Pretending is supposed to be simple. Pretending is supposed to be safe. Pretending is supposed to be controlled. You say the right words, you smile at the right moments, you follow the script, you play the part. But no one warns you what happens when the script begins to feel real, when the lines you recite start echoing in your heart long after the scene is over, when the boundaries you drew so carefully begin to blur, smudge, and finally disappear. She stepped into the role thinking it would be exactly that, a role, a temporary illusion, a performance she could walk away from at any moment. She convinced herself that she was strong enough, logical enough, grounded enough to keep the walls high and her emotions steady. But pretending has a way of opening doors we didn't know were locked. At first it was harmless, innocent, simple touches, public smiles, shared glances, the choreography of a fake romance. Yet beneath each gesture, beneath every rehearsed moment of closeness, something unfamiliar began to stir. Something neither of them had prepared for. The trouble with acting like you care is that sometimes your heart forgets it's supposed to be acting. She noticed it in the way he looked at her during quiet moments. Not the practiced gaze for photographers or the charming smirk he perfected in boardroom negotiations, but a raw, searching look, a look that asked questions his mouth never dared to speak. She felt the shift in the silence between them, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward or forced, but intimate, a silence that held weight. A silence that understood them better than words ever could. Pretending didn't cover that. Pretending couldn't explain that. Pretending wasn't supposed to feel like that. He felt the battle inside himself even more intensely. He had created rules, set boundaries, carved lines in stone, all to keep this arrangement from becoming something dangerous, something unpredictable, something that could unravel him. But every time she laughed, something in him softened. Every time she rolled her eyes playfully, something in him sparked. Every time she called him out on his guarded nature, something in him cracked. It was in the little things, like when she fell asleep beside him during a long flight, and he found himself watching the calm rise and fall of her breathing, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Like when she adjusted his tie before a charity event, and his heartbeat stumbled, betraying him completely. Like when he caught her staring at him without realizing it, and the warmth in her gaze stole the words from his throat. They were pretending, yes, but the feelings that grew in the spaces between the pretense, the unscripted spaces, were real. That was the battle neither of them spoke about, the battle between what they agreed to and what they were becoming. She tried to remind herself, it's just an act. But how do you call it acting when his fingertips linger on your skin longer than necessary? When your pulse changes just by hearing him say your name? When a fake date starts to feel less like a performance and more like a moment you wish could last? He tried to remind himself, she must not fall for me. But how do you keep your distance when you're drawn to her honesty like a lifeline? When her presence calms storms inside you that you've never been able to quiet? When you find yourself wanting to tell her things you've never confessed to anyone? He felt it, she felt it, but neither of them dared to acknowledge it, because acknowledging it meant admitting they were losing their grip. Admitting the line between pretending and feeling was no longer clean. Admitting that the act had become the truth, or dangerously close to it. The struggle became a silent war. They held themselves back even as they got closer. They tried to maintain distance even as they leaned in. They pretended not to care even as they began caring too much. Some nights, she lay awake wondering if he felt it too. The pull, the shift, the ache of wanting something forbidden. She wondered if his rule, "Don't fall in love with me," was meant for her. Or for himself. Some nights he stayed late in his office, staring at their photos from events. Photos that were supposed to be staged, but held something startlingly genuine. He told himself he was imagining it. He told himself feelings were dangerous. He told himself she deserved someone simpler, softer, safer. But the heart has a terrible talent for disobeying. The real battle wasn't the public charade they performed. The real battle was inside them, the battle between the role they agreed to play and the connection they never saw coming. Pretending brought them together. Feeling threatened to expose them. And somewhere between the lies they told the world and the truths they tried to deny themselves, they began to lose track of which was which. Courage is often misunderstood. People imagine it as something loud, heroic, grand, battles won, mountains climbed, risks taken in full view of the world. But the bravest moments of our lives rarely look like that. Sometimes courage is quiet, sometimes it trembles, sometimes it whispers instead of roars, and sometimes courage is simply the decision to listen to your own heart even when it terrifies you. For her, courage was not about stepping into his world, not about facing cameras or elite circles or polished smiles that were anything but sincere. Those things were intimidating, yes, but they weren't the hardest part. The hardest part was facing what she felt for him. Because feelings are unpredictable. Feelings complicate things. Feelings can break you in ways life never taught you to prepare for. She had built her life on practicality, on logic, on knowing where she stood. Yet suddenly she found herself on ground that shifted every time he looked at her a certain way. Every time he let his guard slip. Every time his voice softened without meaning to. Her courage wasn't about fighting the world, it was about fighting herself. Fighting the desire to lean in when he stood too close. Fighting the longing to read deeper meaning into every warm glance. Fighting the hope that flickered inside her chest whenever she realized he trusted her more than he meant to. Hope was dangerous. Hope made her vulnerable. Hope whispered possibilities that she was terrified to believe. Meanwhile, his courage looked different, but was just as difficult. He wasn't used to emotional risk. He wasn't used to letting anyone too close, too deep. The world had taught him harshly and repeatedly that trust was expensive and love was an illusion that came with unbearable consequences. He knew how to conquer markets. He knew how to dismantle rivals. He knew how to predict outcomes with almost supernatural accuracy. But he didn't know how to deal with her. He didn't know how to deal with the way she made him feel seen in ways he didn't recognize in himself. He didn't know how to deal with the way she softened the edges of his life, edges he'd sharpened to protect himself. He didn't know how to deal with the way she made him want things he had forbidden himself to want. And admitting that took courage he wasn't sure he possessed. The courage to face your heart is different from any other kind of bravery. It demands honesty. It demands vulnerability. It demands letting go of the illusion of safety. He wrestled with that every time she was near. Some days he convinced himself he felt nothing, that it was all an act A temporary arrangement that meant as little as he pretended it did. But then she would laugh, really laugh, and something in him unraveled. Or she'd touch his wrist absent-mindedly, and his breath would catch before he could stop it. Or she'd defend him even when she didn't have to, and he felt a warmth inside him that he didn't know how to name. It terrified him, it thrilled him, it threatened him, and in that tension, in that battle between fear and longing, courage quietly emerged. Not the bold, reckless courage of someone rushing into danger, but the slow, trembling courage of someone allowing himself to feel again. Some nights he asked himself questions he never expected to ask. What if she mattered more than he intended? What if she wanted something real? What if he did too? What if letting her go would hurt more than keeping her close? He didn't have the answers. But courage isn't about having answers, it's about being willing to face the questions. She faced her heart each time she reminded herself that feelings have consequences. He faced his each time he tried, and failed, to keep his distance. Both of them lived in this emotional limbo, balanced on a dangerous edge between denial and desire. And that edge demanded bravery from both sides. Because falling in love is not merely a choice, it is a surrender of the barriers we spent years building, a surrender of the beliefs that protected us, a surrender of the fears we hold close because they are familiar, comforting, predictable. To face the heart, you must be willing to step into the unknown, to lose control, to risk pain, to risk change, to risk wanting someone who might never feel the same. She found courage each time she looked at him and didn't turn away. He found courage each time he allowed her to see the softer parts of him, the ones he thought he had buried long ago. And together, without speaking it aloud, they began walking toward a truth that scared them both. Not because it was wrong, not because it was impossible, but because it was real, real feelings, real fear, real connection, real vulnerability. Courage doesn't always look like a leap. Sometimes it looks like a slow, hesitant step forward into a feeling you don't fully understand. And as the days passed, as their connection deepened, as pretending turned into something neither of them could easily deny, they discovered that the bravest thing either of them could do was simply to admit what their hearts already knew. Rules exist for one reason: to protect us. We create them to mark boundaries, to define limits, to control the parts of life we fear might otherwise consume us. Rules are shields, until the moment they become chains. And in their arrangement, fragile, dangerous, intoxicating, there was one rule that stood above all the others: don't fall in love. Simple, uncomplicated, final. It should have been easy. It was meant to protect both of them. It was meant to keep the line between acting and reality perfectly drawn, thick, unbreakable. But the truth about rules, especially emotional ones, is that the very moment they are spoken aloud, they begin to spark rebellion deep inside the heart. At first, the rule was a guardrail. It gave them structure. It gave them distance. It gave them the illusion that they were safe. But safety is a strange thing. The closer they grew, the more that rule shifted from safety to suffocation. For him, the rule was armor, a way to ensure that his vulnerability never expanded into something uncontrollable, something he couldn't walk away from. A way to remind himself that this arrangement was temporary, that she was temporary. But the more time he spent with her, the more that rule became a whisper in the back of his mind rather than a command. And for her, the rule was a warning, a reminder that no matter how warm he was in private moments, no matter how gentle he became in rare flashes, no matter how deeply he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, he was not supposed to be hers. He couldn't be, he wouldn't be. He had said it himself. That rule created a tension neither of them could ignore. It hovered over every conversation, every almost touch, every heated silence. It followed them into rooms, into cars, into late nights when they sat too close and breathed too softly. It pulsed like a heartbeat beneath every moment where the truth threatened to break free, because the more they tried to follow the rule, the more impossible it became to obey. Rules crumble fastest under pressure, and their pressure was constant. It was in the moment he reached for her hand without thinking, in the way she leaned into his touch, without pretending anymore. In the stolen glances that lasted longer than they should. In the warmth that filled the space between them even when they were silent. In the ache that lingered after they walked away from each other. The rule said don't fall, but their hearts were already tilting, trembling, slipping toward the edge, and that terrified them. The rule made every interaction sharper, heavier, more dangerous. A simple brush of fingers felt like crossing a forbidden border. A shared laugh felt like a confession. A moment of eye contact felt like temptation in its purest form. The rule wasn't just something they were breaking. It was something they were fighting. He fought it because he wasn't ready to admit how much she mattered. He fought it because caring for someone had cost him more pain than he wanted to relive. He fought it because he feared that once he let her in, he would lose the control he'd spent years building. And she fought it because she didn't want to fall for a man who had warned her not to. She fought it because she didn't want to mistake temporary tenderness for something permanent. She fought it because she feared the heartbreak that waited on the other side of wanting someone she couldn't have. The rule became the silent enemy in their story. It was the tension behind every pause. The reason they hesitated when their lips were inches apart. The invisible force pulling them together and pushing them apart at the same time. They tried to keep the rule intact. They truly did. But rules don't survive intimacy. Not the kind of intimacy they shared, not the quiet confessions slipped between breaths, not the unguarded moments that revealed who they really were beneath the facades, not the connection that deepened every time they let their walls down without meaning to. And the more the rule cracked, the more desperate they both became to pretend it wasn't happening. He reminded her, she reminded herself, they reminded each other, we're pretending, this isn't real, we cannot fall. We must not fall, but the heart doesn't care about rules, and love laughs at them. Love doesn't appear with permission, it doesn't wait for logic, it doesn't obey warnings, it grows in the stolen moments, in the unspoken feelings, in the fear of losing someone you never intended to want. The rule that was meant to protect them began to destroy them instead. It forced them to hold back when they wanted to reach out. It forced them to act unfazed when they were anything but. It forced them to pretend indifference when everything inside them was burning with longing. And as the days went on, as their connection deepened, as the line between pretense and reality blurred beyond recognition, they both knew long before they dared to admit it, that the rule that once kept them safe was about to become the rule that would change everything, whether they wanted it to or not. And so, as their story unfolded, something remarkable happened, something neither of them had planned for, prepared for, or allowed themselves to expect. The lines they drew began to blur, the rules they created began to break, and the walls they built began to quietly fall, brick by guarded brick. Because the truth is this: you can choose to hide your heart, you can choose to deny your feelings, you can choose to pretend a connection doesn't exist. But the heart has a way of whispering its truth louder than any rule ever spoken. She had entered his world as an agreement. He had welcomed her into his life as protection. But somewhere between the silence, the stolen glances, and the unspoken confessions, something real took root, something neither of them could ignore. He had asked her for one role, he had given her one rule, but life, its irony, its unpredictability, its ability to twist destiny with a single heartbeat, had other plans. Because when two souls collide, even accidentally, even unwillingly, they leave marks on each other, marks that don't disappear once the pretending ends, marks that don't fade simply because someone said, "Don't fall in love." And perhaps the most breathtaking truth of all was this: they both broke the rule, not out of weakness, not out of carelessness, but because every shared moment demanded honesty, an honesty deeper than fear, deeper than pride, deeper than any contract could contain. And in the quiet space between who they were and who they were becoming, they discovered something far more powerful than pretending, far more dangerous than desire, and far more beautiful than either of them had dared to imagine. They discovered that the heart, once awakened, writes its own story. A story no rule can silence, a story no arrangement can confine, a story that begins with a whisper and ends with a truth neither of them can walk away from.